Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Once called a perfect tropical paradise in South Asia, the island nation of Sri Lanka is now trapped in both economic and political quagmire after protesters stormed the official residences of both the country's president and prime minister. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has fled the country, apparently having resigned. What has led to Sri Lanka's national bankruptcy, and can a new government, unity government, to be formed, lead the country back to normal? To consider these questions, I'm joined by Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, Murtaza Jafferjee, Chairman of the Advocata Institute, Dr. Pradeep Taneja, Academic Fellow at the Australia-India Institute of the University of Melbourne, and Uditha Devapriya, Chief Analyst of International Relations at Factum. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Well, welcome to the show, gentlemen. First, I will start with you, Murtaza. You are on the ground, so the situation seems is a bit unclear. Like the president has fled the country, but at the same time, we heard that the current prime minister was appointed as the acting president. Seems Mr. Gotabaya still exercising his constitutional right.
That's correct. What I'm made to understand is that he has to resign by giving a letter in his own handwriting. There is a meeting as we speak of party leaders convened by the speaker, and maybe as we speak this letter, his resignation letter will be presented, which will be official confirmation of his resignation. But until now, basically he has appointed the prime minister to act as the president.
Okay, so what does this step mean to the country, and also tell us how life is like for people in the country?
So, at the moment today has been a chaotic day, because the protesters don't like what is happening, that the current Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe doesn't seem to be acceptable to them, and they have marched on his office, which is in a highly residential area called Flower Road, and there was a confrontation with the police, but they have breached the gate and now they have occupied the building. So, pretty much, and due to the uncertainty in the country, the acting president has imposed curfew, which doesn't seem to have been imposed, because people are freely walking about on the road. Today also happens to be a holiday. It's a full moon, it's a Buddhist holiday. So, pretty much most people are at home.
So things are probably sort of better because of the holiday. People stay at home. Dr. Pradeep Taneja from Australia. We know the crisis has been going on for months, but do you expect matters go this way? At this couple of days?
No, to be honest, I did not expect the situation to get as bad as it has. Sri Lanka, of course, has been a fairly stable country, apart from the civil war, which ended in 2009. So I did not expect Sri Lanka to actually come to this particular situation at the moment. I mean, the situation obviously is very chaotic. The president, we heard, has fled the country. He's supposed to be in Maldives now. So it really, to me, it comes as a surprise that the president and the government allowed the situation to deteriorate to such an extent.
Well, Rong Ying, you see there's a crisis. You expect the government, of course, under severe pressure to deal with the crisis, mostly economic, at least previously. And then it evolved into something like, obviously, a political crisis, resignation of the former prime minister and the president and the Rajapaksa family, basically. So, that actually, is it a deepening the crisis or make it easier to deal with the crisis?
Well, the answer is
I
do not.
The crisis.
Rong Ying, please. Yeah.
It's all right. The answer is I don't know. I think the situation is really uncertain and fluid. First and foremost, I think it looks like we have a sort of constitutional crisis. If the former president or the outgoing president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, did not sort of hand in that resignation, I think Prime Minister Wickramasinghe would be unconstitutionally to act as the president. But even though the resignation letter was presented at the meeting, I think it's just the beginning of more uncertainties, because in the end, I think we are going to have, or Sri Lanka is going to have, elect or select a new president, which is supposed to take over on 20th. And Prime Minister or acting President Wickramasinghe has already said that he is going to resign, and is actually declared the design. So we really have many. It's really a kind of very uncertain and fluid situation. The fortunate thing is that despite these uncertainties, the overall situation remains quite stable, despite the protests, the storming of the presidential residence, which is, I think, the pictures have been, the videos have been go viral, and of course the economic difficulties, the hardships that I don't think it would be have easy or early sort of answer in the days or weeks ahead.
Right. We'll come back and take a look at what's the way out for the country. But before that, Murtaza, what are the factors? What are the major factors that lead to this country to this day? Let's say economically, what went wrong?
So I would say that it's 30% misfortune, 70% mismanagement. Leading up to this crisis, we had some weather issues, and then of course the COVID crisis, and we had previous to COVID, we had an Easter bombing. But 70% of this crisis is due to mismanagement, failures in monetary and fiscal policy, and a disastrous policy in trying to move over to organic agriculture overnight, which significantly impacted food production. Food inflation is running close to 100%, the currency has depreciated by 80%, and our debt to GDP has exploded, and it has become totally unsustainable, because in 2020 our international rating had been cut a number of times, and we have now suspended repayment on our external debt. So we are unable to access hard currency, and the reserves on the day that we suspended our debt was a mere $5 million. So there is a tremendous shortage of dollars, and the Ukraine crisis did not help, because there was a significant increase in international commodity prices, including the price of oil and cooking gas, which has created enormous shortages for households, which is the reason why people have come out on the streets.
Okay, it's mismanagement. Where did it start, or when did it start? You mean mismanagement of the economy? Murtaza.
So there was a problem even before this. Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Before this government came in December 2019, there was a problem with the economy, that there was an enormous amount of debt. We were already in an IMF program, the 16th IMF program. And then when this government came in with the expectation of creating a fiscal stimulus, they significantly cut taxes. 3 months to 4 months after that, COVID hit. So we had a contraction in economic activity, which created further problems for government revenue. Thereafter, the rating was cut. So this problem probably has been brewing for 10 years, but it got accentuated 2.5 years ago.
Pradeep, obviously, probably like any other countries, Sri Lanka is also affected by what's going on in Ukraine, the crisis there, and also COVID-19, almost 2 years, more than 2 years. So it's difficult, for a lot of developing countries in particular, right?
It is difficult, and obviously, the current situation in COVID and then the war in Ukraine hasn't helped the situation in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka used to rely very heavily on tourism from particularly Russia and Ukraine. They were major sources of tourists for Sri Lanka. So clearly it has affected foreign exchange earnings of Sri Lanka. But I would agree with your previous speaker the situation is at least 70% made by the leadership itself. It is mismanagement, poor governance by the Rajapaksa family. And there is, of course, an element of misfortune or bad luck. The COVID and the war in Ukraine were beyond the control of the Sri Lankan government. But certainly, I think mismanagement and very poor governance has been behind this crisis.
Rong Ying, what's your point? What's your take? What are the factors that somehow affect this country so much that basically it's on default, it's bankrupted?
Well, in general, I agree with the previous two speakers' viewpoint. Only except that the division of factors, the mismanagement or misfortune. I think the problem of Sri Lanka's economic development, physical difficulties, too much borrowing heavily from external forces, in particular the international commercial loans, which now I think has taken up more than 56% something compared to only 2.4 in 2004. That is something I think a factor that is known to all. The unfortunate thing is a patient with very heavy sort of fundamental diseases, and when the COVID-19, the pandemic hit, the vulnerability is so vulnerable that it's being hit by the pandemic. And the reason is that the external forces, the external factors has been hitting so hard to the extent that Sri Lanka is simply not possible to resist, despite the fact that I think any government would try to do. The terrorist attacks before the COVID-19 in 2019, I think was the beginning. And then the COVID, and also of course the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and also I think above all the hiking of interest rates of developed economies, United States, Europe, has also aggregated the situation, serving as the last straw that break the back of a camel. So we are now looking at a very difficult, very unfortunate situation, mismanagement, misgovernance, and indeed misfortune that I think beyond the capability, beyond the
ability to deal with it.
Right.
Pradeep, some say Sri Lanka's economic problems began long before Gotabaya took office in 2019. They say from 1977 onwards, successive governments built the country on precarious foundation of debt, plus a welfare state. So that creates potential problems for a long time to come.
Well, don't forget that the Rajapaksa brothers were in power, during the Civil War and after the Civil War, and a lot of the debt was incurred after the Civil War. So this whole massive expansion of fiscal deficit, started after the Civil War when the Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the president at the time, and of course in the current government, he's been the prime minister until a couple of weeks ago. And Mahinda Rajapaksa's government borrowed very heavily, borrowed both on the commercial markets and from other countries like Japan and China. So this program was very irresponsible. They undertook to build projects which were not necessary at the time. They borrowed money to build projects, and obviously one of the best examples is the Hambantota Port and Hambantota Airport. And these were not the only two projects, but they were typical of the kind of projects that the Sri Lankan government was building with borrowed money borrowed from financial institutions, money borrowed on the money markets. So the mismanagement started under the Rajapaksa government previously, and then of course there was a change of government for a few years, and then the Rajapaksa family came back to power. And I say Rajapaksa family because it has been like a family firm. because not just the president, but the prime minister, the finance minister. So there's 5 or 6 members of the family who were part of this government. So mismanagement has been happening for a long time, but the government that preceded the Gotabaya government, they also continued on the same pattern. They also continued to borrow.
Murtaza, in terms of this economic policies, in terms of the economic structure, is there anything problems probably goes beyond the 2019, starting from 1977, this welfare state to this borrowing, import less and, and import more, export less. So that creates problems for, a problem long time in the making.
Yes, so we did have a very strong welfare state in the 1950s and 60s because we had a population explosion, but that was not a phenomenon more recently, because as a proportion of GDP, the allocation towards education and healthcare actually has been falling, and the amount of subsidies in terms of cash transfers also is a very small part of the total expenditure. I have a slightly different issue here. First is that there was misallocation of resources. So, we have not embraced the market economy and we have been interfering in market prices. So, for example, electricity prices have not been revised for over 10 years and inflation has been in mid single digits, but in this whole period they did not revise. Similarly, that energy prices are not market determined, invariably there is political interference with the misplaced belief that you can do subsidy transfer through prices. And what happened is that the top 10% of households account for 36% of national income. So, it was completely mistargeted. The second issue that we have had is that we have completely destroyed our tax base. Our tax to GDP last year was below 8%. A middle income country like us should have a tax to GDP close to 15 or 16%. And that is the key reason why we had such large fiscal deficits. The primary deficit last year was 6%, minus 6% of GDP. The third issue is that on the expenditure side, although Pradeep did focus on many white elephant projects that were partly funded from overseas borrowing, there is again a very large Sri Lankan military that has been maintained 13 years after the end of the conflict. This is also straining the budget, and we also have 1.5 million people in the public service. Out of a labor force of 8 million people, 1.5 million people work for the government. Now, after interest, salaries and pensions are the second and third largest expense structure. So, this is where I said that it is a lot to do with misallocation of resources and insufficient revenue to pay for those resources. So, we ended up borrowing from commercial markets, including domestic debt markets, crowding out borrowings. That is the root cause of this crisis.
Yeah, mismanagement in the sense is, mismanagement of the sources and also the debt from the commercial market. So, Murtaza, what's the next? People are talking about a possible bailout, let's say, by the International Monetary Fund. But before that, it requires a stable government, right?
Yes. So, we need a government that has legitimacy and stability in parliament. We will have to come up with an interim arrangement because the opposition has a very small number of seats in parliament. The minimum time period to have an election, what I am informed, is 6 weeks. So, we will have to have an interim president that is acceptable to all the parties in the parliament, and we will have to move as fast as possible to have some kind of election where a new mandate can be handed over to a government. Thereafter, basically we have to finish negotiating with the IMF for a staff level agreement, which was expected during the course of this month, but it might now get postponed. Then we have to restructure our debt, and there are bilateral creditors and commercial creditors, and we need to have a speedy resolution. We have appointed 2 advisors, Lazard as the financial advisor and another legal firm, and thereafter the IMF will sign off, the board of the IMF will sign off on a bailout.
We'll sign off on the bailout, up to the International Monetary Fund. Obviously, that will require a lot of negotiation between the two sides, the government. So, Rong Ying, are you expecting a new unity government anytime soon?
Who?
Yeah, Rong Ying, please. Yeah.
Is that
Okay,
please for me?
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Rong Ying, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I wish and I hope and pray that the situation will stabilize as soon as possible, and if we can work out the differences politically. But I suspect that it will, given the history and given the politics in Sri Lanka, it may take longer than we expected. I would like to come back a little bit about the sort of our conversation about what's wrong, where I think the priorities or the allocations of the previous governments in terms of the resources. I think if we took the shoes of the leaders, previous government, whoever they are, and the future government leaders in particular, they have to really balance the need for development, infrastructure, power, energy, and everything, and the day-to-day need to feed, to provide the basic social services, hospitals, educations. It's really a difficult position. Whatever the case, I think we'll wish Sri Lanka good luck, and we wish that they would continue to, as they should be, exercise a sense of solidarity, and with the support and assistance of friendly countries like China, India, and others, and the international community to out of these current difficulties as soon as possible.
Well, Murtaza, currently there are, assistance, obviously, as pointed out by Rong Ying, from friendly countries, China, India included over there. What else can the country do right now, for people in particular, if they find it hard to access to, say, enough food or drug you need, or some other products you need import from other countries?
So we will require humanitarian aid, because the bottom 20% of the population only account for 4.5% of national income, and with inflation running at 70%, whatever financial savings that they have is completely destroyed. So my first request is to many developed countries to assist Sri Lanka with humanitarian aid and make sure that it goes to the people who need it the most. The second is, since I am on Chinese TV, I want to flag that China, your central bank has given us a 10 billion yuan swap, which is about $1.5 billion. Unfortunately, we cannot use it because there are certain conditionalities attached to it, like 3 months of exports, certain export cover, reserve cover, etc. If some kind of flexibility is offered to our central bank that these conditionalities are relaxed, this will be much needed liquidity in a very difficult time.
Well, Rong Ying, obviously, it would be good, if there are some, more assistance from developed countries, from European countries, from the United States or Japan. What are the responses from, say, the developed world right now?
Well, in general, I think we have seen that the international community has responded very much positively, I think, to Sri Lanka. The problem is that, of course, given the ongoing conflict, the challenges, the pandemic, the disruptions, we have many sort of countries are on the verge or having similar challenges for that. So China, certainly as a friendly country of Sri Lanka, we have tried our best, humanitarian assistance, not only from the government sources, but also from various kind of walks of life, local governments, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, I think the China is continue to working together with the international community, with the international financial institutions to work out a feasible way to address the problems facing Sri Lanka. In the meantime, I think the international community also work together to, I think, to push for a better sort of environment, and not only I think is affecting Sri Lanka per se, but the other vulnerable developing countries. So in other words, if we have more problems like Sri Lanka, it will be very difficult for the international community to mobilize that. For that, I think we need to call upon more efforts, more solidarity, and certainly more coordination and collaboration on that.
Oh, well, Rong Ying, a follow-up question. You mentioned about the vulnerability, for example, of Sri Lanka government, and also challenges for developing world. What are the lessons, for other countries who are maybe in a similar situation? For example, at least basically every country is facing these surging oil prices, for example, and even food crisis. And yeah, there's a lot of pressure on many governments around the world, in particular developing world.
Well, of course, for a particular country that is facing problems, facing challenges, facing difficulties, the first and foremost issue is that a kind of sense of solidarity, a sense of unity, it's a sense of togetherness to share the difficulties, not, sort of bringing in chaos and other. This is, I think, the most important thing. But for that, of course, the leadership has to be really to show the leadership, and more importantly, you have to win the trust and the support of the general public. I think this is probably one of the most important lessons of the Sri Lanka leadership. Sri Lanka, the outgoing Rajapaksa President Rajapaksa and his family should learn. And secondly, I believe, of course, I think instead of blaming each other, we need to work together. At the recent foreign ministers' meetings of G20, the Chinese put forward an initiative for food security, and 8 points initiative,
yes.
Very important.
Yes, finally we got Uditha Devapriya, Chief Analyst of International Relations at Factum. Welcome to our show, Uditha. So, what's the next step for the country to deal with the ongoing crisis?
Well, it looks like things turn from bad to worse, in the sense that on the day that the president was supposed to resign from his post, the outgoing prime minister, the prime minister who serves as such under him, has basically declared himself the acting president until at least the 20th of July. So this isn't what's bad. What's bad is that he has declared a curfew and has declared a state of emergency in the country. He has, of course, given his reasons. He states that certain recent incidents involving the burning of personal residences and the storming of government property called for such extensive measures. But that's not going to go well with the people of the country. They are just going to amplify their demands for his resignation, Mr. Wickremesinghe's resignation. Now that the protesters have got their first objective met, namely the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, I believe that they will now shift their focus to Mr. Wickremesinghe. That, of course, it will all depend on the differences between Mr. Rajapaksa and Mr. Wickremesinghe as far as political crises of this sort are concerned.
A political crisis fundamentally is about an economic crisis. Well, many thanks to our guests. On that, we're coming to the end of today's show. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.